Welcome to A Procurement Podcast, the Reform Rundown, with your hosts Chris Robinson and Fleur Summers.
Over the course of this series, Fleur and I will be discussing some of the main themes and concepts surrounding the Procurement Act 2023 and what it will mean to the public sector ahead of launch. Fleur and I have a combined 40 years public sector procurement experience and will be using some of that experience to share our knowledge and insights around the Act itself.
So let's get into today's topic.
Hello and welcome to episode 12 of A Procurement Podcast, the Reform Rundown. We do hope that you've enjoyed our previous episode where Fleur and I gave our views on what we believe to be the main features of the Act, along with our thoughts as to the activities the sector could consider by way of best practice that they could intend on making a start to in regards to getting themselves business ready for go live.
So this episode, along with all our previous episodes, can be found on our usual podcast streaming providers. So you'll see within our posts, that's Apple and Spotify. But since our last episode, we are actually now available to listen to on Amazon Music, which is really exciting. So all you have to do is just search A Procurement Podcast, the Reform Rundown, and you'll find us there on all those three hosting providers.
And speaking of finding us, that's exactly what a few of our listeners have done just recently. And yeah, I'm sure, Fleur, you'll agree that it's great to get their feedback, and we encourage that to keep coming, keep providing us that feedback around the podcast, around the content, because ultimately that what you do provide us by way of feedback is excellent in terms of suggestions for us to cover in forthcoming episodes, and of equal value. It's fantastic just in general, right? To connect with so many of you within the procurement community, within the public sector, especially, of course, with the Act less than 2 months away. There is a lot to be discussed.
So you mentioned discussed. Obviously, we discuss quite a lot of things on here and our general conversations, but what sort of things are you thinking at the moment that are key to being discussed?
I can read your mind, Fleur. I really can. And we are absolutely not going there. No chance at all.
Do you not think we might want to just touch on it briefly? Just a little bit?
I'm looking at my notes here, Fleur, and it's not in the notes. I really don't think we should be doing this.
But you always go off script, so what do you think?
I do, don't I? I do. You've called me out there, haven't you? I can't argue with you, so go on then. Let's give you the opportunity.
Okay. So at the time of recording this episode, so there's quite a lot of rumours, aren't there, at the moment, especially on LinkedIn, around the potential postponement of the Procurement Act. So I think, to be fair, we probably heard some of these rumours around the recording of the last podcast episode, but it's sort of gathering a lot more pace and a lot more people joining it at the moment.
Yeah, it seems to be the case, doesn't it? And as you say there, the LinkedIn in particular seems awash with rumours around the Act and potential postponements and what that may look like. But I think the operative word here is rumours, and I suppose really not wanting. Yeah, exactly. Not wanting to pour cold water over this. And as you say, at the time of recording now, that is ultimately what they are, rumours, until some form of an official announcement has been made.
Yeah, so I think we saw quite a lot on LinkedIn, wasn't there? A lot of discussions around from obviously colleagues similar to us in procurement and legal organisations suggesting like postponements was potential. But yeah, that's about all we know.
Yeah, exactly. But they can't, can they? Can they, Fleur, really? I mean, wow. I suppose they could do. You know, and that said, the way these rumours are growing, I'm sure that the sector would, and I know me and you certainly would as well, you know, appreciate some reassurance from the Cabinet Office either way, and ultimately sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I agree. But I think the main thing is it's like, even if there is, it's postponement, isn't it? It's not cancelling. So it's just around if they are going to do it, what postponement means. Does it mean few weeks, months? Yeah, that's key, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. No, definitely. And I know me and you do like a gossip, don't we? We do like a little bit of speculation. And, you know, we've been kind of looking at guidance notes that have been released so far. We've been having a look at what the general temperature, if you will, is by way of the comments that have been going around and circling around on LinkedIn. But I don't know, just gut feel. Perhaps maybe it's the central digital platform, and you know, if you were taking bets, I mean, you were running a book on this. Perhaps maybe, you know, the central digital platform itself would be the 11 to 10 favourite in that case.
Yeah, so maybe we just need to watch this space and see what happens, see if there's an announcement.
Yeah, ultimately, I suppose we've not got much choice until then, have we?
No, not at all. So today's episode, I think we're going to be doing something slightly different, aren't we?
We are, yeah. And some of you will know that I'm a bit of a CIPS geek, or geek in general, let's be honest, But, with regards to CIPS, having delivered the qualification to learners across the sectors over the last 10 years or so.
Yeah, and so with CIPS being very prevalent in the public sector, we were thinking that surely there has to be some sort of tool that we can use to help identify the activities defined by the Procurement Act, whether that's pre or post go live. So we won't be able to cover all the changes that we will see with the introduction of the Procurement Act in the next few podcast episodes that will come in, but we'll look to try and highlight some of the key areas within each stage of a life cycle compared to a procurement that is above threshold. So we're only going to be looking at those that are above threshold and therefore caught by the regulations.
Sure, definitely, and it's probably right to say at this particular point as well that with the procurement, CIPS procurement and supply cycle, you and I we've spent quite a bit of time on this, haven't we, Fleur? Trying to marry up the steps within the cycle and where that best fits in terms of the narrative of the Act. And as you've rightly said already, with it being so prevalent, CIPS that is within public sector procurement, it is a tool that covers the end-to-end procurement process, which is why we felt that it sits quite well around the Act and us talking around that. And this is going to be, because the cycle is so big and the number of steps within it, it's going to be the first of two episodes that we're going to be discussing the cycle and relating it to the content of the Act itself. And for today, we'll go through defined business needs and specification through to supplier selection to participate to tender. That's ultimately what it is. And in terms of those particular steps then of the cycle itself, we're looking at steps 1 through to step 5. Yeah, 5. Yeah, just thinking now off the top of my head.
Just as a thing, if I can get the editing right of this podcast and everything, there will be a image somewhere. No, wrong side. I can't get my left and rights today on the screen as to where the tool that we're thinking of and how we'll be using it.
Yeah, no, definitely. It'll be a useful visual aid, I'm sure, as you and I are rattling through the various steps.
Yeah, exactly. But just from us looking at this and having some discussions and revisiting it in preparation for this podcast, there's definitely some memories and nightmares and all that sort of stuff coming back from CIPS studies and, having to go through this so many times.
Goodness me, yeah, 100%. And you think again, as I'm sure many of the listeners to our podcast have either completed CIPS themselves and CIPS status or going on their CIPS procurement journey right now. It is a familiar, popular tool that is covered in. Oh, I'm going to stick my neck out now.
Most modules? Yeah,
80% of the modules throughout all levels of the qualification, which again, hopefully brings that relatability in terms of what we're discussing today, considering the Procurement Act. So, okay, a reminder that this is the CIPS procurement and supply cycle. It's generic, of course, with the intention of covering as broad a spectrum of sectors and the businesses alike.
Okay, so we're going to start with define business needs and develop specification. So from having a look at this and thinking around what this stage could be, this really is your category planning stage at the beginning, isn't it? And you're determining what it is that you want to look at procuring, or what approaches and recommendations are in terms of ways forward for specific areas of spend. As you'll be aware, often in public sector, this need will come from the function or service area or department who have raised the requirement for the procurement team. Now, I guess in the new world of the Procurement Act 2023, should the organisation's expenditure be equal or in excess of 100 million, then the requirement should already be detailed within the contracts database, forward pipeline. And don't forget, you could include about pipeline notices, which are also going to be under the new Procurement Act too. So we need to consider the publication of your pipeline as well. So that's the intention of the Act, at least. However, we all know in the real world that there will be no doubt instances where unforecasted procurements will crop up.
Yeah, no, definitely. And as you say, that's a really interesting point, that, because again, the Act, the suggestion and the instruction, actually, for want of a better term, within the Act is that all procurements are captured. But the reality of it is, as we know, the number of years you and I work directly within the sector, that's not always possible. The best will in the world, so there can be requirements that could be crop up that are unplanned, potentially, one-offs.
Urgent requirements.
Yeah, for sure. And it would be a real task, and I would go as far to say it's impossible to be able to include all procurements within that particular approach, definitely. So, in terms of the Procurement Act, this could be potentially the new PIN notices or the planned procurement notice, as of course it is known, that will have to be published on the central digital platform. Fleur, we're not going to discuss the central digital platform any further than what we've done already, but that will be what it will be called going forwards. Of course, the planned procurement notice. May want to use this to alert the market that you will be looking out to go out to undertake a formal procurement at a later date. At a similar time, you could be looking to make a start to the specification for the requirements in its broadest form. Now, more detail in terms of the development would come in the next stage of the cycle.
Okay, so if we're moving on to the next stage, so this really is around market analysis and make or buy discussion or decision. So I know that we had quite a few discussions, didn't we, around market analysis, but I guess this might be some of the first steps where the cycle does not necessarily map completely to a typical public sector way of procurement. But bearing in mind, as we said before, whilst this cycle is well known in terms of the CIPS book, CIPS studies, from those in the sector that have undertaken their CIPS qualifications or working for it at the moment, we need to remember that it's generic. CIPS have an unenviable task of trying to find an approach that covers all sector and all organisation types.
Yeah, absolutely. But, again, at this point, at this particular step, which, again, as Fleur's already mentioned, is market analysis and make or buy decision, you might want to consider here to the development of the strategy and plan step. You might want to think about applying some of the common CIPS academic models to the procurement subject matter. Yeah, it does. Yeah. Well, okay. Then when we talk about reoccurring nightmares, then Fleur, so SWOT, steeple, Porter's 5 forces, Kraljic 4-box matrices, of course, the supplier preferencing models, etc. Yeah. Now, I would suggest that this, when by undertaking such an exercise like this at this particular step, will give you a more rounded understanding of the external supply market, along with an indication as to how you could map out your strategy to follow.
Yeah, definitely. And that then leads on to develop the strategy and plan. So if we take the 2 steps previous to that and consider them to be part of the pre-formal procurement fact-finding exercise, then you have your develop your strategy and plan is where you take all the intel that you've learned, both internally and externally sourced, and use it to seek internal approvals or internal governance, those type of things, the process that you have. So by way of the procurement strategy, route to market, and of course not forgetting budget approval if not obtained already before this step.
Yeah, definitely. So in short, we will use the insights and information gleaned from the preliminary market engagement activities to develop the approach to the procurement itself. Now, there are a few things you could consider here in terms of the Act, and this is probably the perfect opportunity to remind you that this is, as we said right at the top of us starting the conversation around the cycle, that this is mine and yours, Fleur's interpretation of how you can use the CIPS Procurement and Supply Cycle to tie into the themes that form part of the Procurement Act and the activities within those.
Yeah, so if we think about thresholds, another timely reminder here that there is no change in terms of thresholds with the Procurement Act that are currently in place at the moment. So these are currently applicable from 1st of January 2024 until 31st of December 2025, so usually a 2-year sort of period in reality. So we aren't expecting any further news on these until towards the end of 2025.
Can I just say on that, Fleur, actually just thinking about some of the conversations we've had with the sector already, and it's interesting that, when we see the guidance notes and obviously the content of the acts and the regulations themselves, me and you've still had quite a lot of questions around that, haven't we, in there? Okay, well, go live 28th of October. Does that mean a change to the thresholds? And I think it's really important there that, you've made that point very clear that there is no change, and the window, if you will, in terms of the existing thresholds still remains the same despite the launch of the Act itself in October.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's loads of things like that as you go, as you think of it in like a procurement process as to what is this changing, is this not changing? But yeah, our understanding is that the thresholds will remain as they are. So no more, you don't have to learn any different numbers quite quickly. Okay, so in this step, you could also look to determine your procurement approach or route to market being taken, which I think we've spoken about in terms of the changes that will be seen with the Procurement Act, but you would look and determine what procedures, for example, would you use an open? Will you use the new competitive flexible procedure? And then how are you going to do your new competitive flexible procedure? Are you going to set up a framework agreement? Are you going to make use of an open framework agreement? Or are you going to explore the use of a dynamic market? Well, there's a lot of choices there, but that's what you would need to be defining in your strategy and planning.
Yeah, there's lots to think about there, isn't there, in terms of, like as you say, the variety of different routes to market that can be taken. You think about the content that you've been able to glean by undertaking the previous steps within the cycle and having a look at considering, that optimum route to market based on internal pressures and challenges, but also the external market and the forces within that. And as I just said there, finding the correct route and the optimum route dependent on the procured subject matter in question, 100%. So one of the biggest exercises within this step would, of course, be the price quality split determination, taking into consideration the change from meat to mat, which we know and, which, of course, we've covered at length in other podcasts. And ultimately, again, with that, how social value, sustainable procurement, innovation, as well as things such as value for money, etc., would also be included. And also within this step, it could be the point in which a conflict assessment needs to be completed and published, which is one of the other areas that is strengthened in terms of the Procurement Act, where this now needs to be completed and confirmed, of course.
Yeah, so just as a bit of a summary, so a conflicts assessment must be prepared before publishing a tender or transparency notice. So you have to have done it before you've done your publish your notice, or a dynamic market notice. So conflict assessment needs to be completed on a regular basis. So you'd want to make sure that you're revisiting it, reviewing and updating it as you go. But it's worth noting, has to be done before your tender notice. So you'll also need to confirm that it has been prepared and revised as part of those notices. So it's a worthwhile activity that you're going to need to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on to the next step then, of course, which is pre-procurement market testing. So many of the activities here we feel that you may well have likely to have completed within the steps prior. So, for example, market analysis and develop the strategy and plan. However, market analysis is, of course, a great opportunity to gather further insights from the market, which can be taken into consideration as part of your requirements and procurements themselves. One could argue that this is, in effect, as I often call it, free consultancy, and the final time that the procurement organisation can obtain unique intel that will help them to further understand and define the specification requirements for the need itself, whether that be from a prerequisite pass-fail perspective or innovative or, in fact, added value point of view. Certainly, in our experience, on the rare occasion, and I'm sure, Fleur, you can relate to this, we have been afforded the opportunity to undertake a deeper dive into market intel or market sounding exercise prior to the formal procurement. It has certainly assisted us in the procurement function or other function or department that themselves have the need.
Yeah, it's definitely a good way of really understanding your market, isn't it, in terms of what you're procuring it for. Key point to note is that this has to take place before the publication of your tender or transparency notice and helps contracting authorities and the market prepare for the procurement. So it's very important when contracting authorities have significant flexibility, which they are now going to find themselves having, to design and tailor their competitive procurement procedures. Of course, we like to talk about notices and those type of things. So there is now going to be a new preliminary market engagement notice, which can be used to invite suppliers to participate in preliminary market engagement or to notify the market that the engagement has taken place. So the use of this notice can help to ensure a level playing field and also attract new suppliers.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a really good point that you made there, Fleur, in regards to the notice itself. And from what we've discussed already, this preliminary market engagement, this market sounding exercise, this opportunity to obtain what is in essence free intel to help you shape, scope, define your requirement within your tender documentation to follow, really is valuable. But ultimately, of course, as we all know, and those of us that work and work within the public sector right now, know that unfortunately, the time required in which to do this exercise isn't always available. And on that point then, contracting authorities are of course not required by the Act to conduct a preliminary market engagement, but if they do, they must publish that preliminary market engagement notice before it publishes a tender notice. Now that sounds obvious, but I just want to make that point there again. Or in the tender notice, explain why it did not publish a preliminary market engagement notice. I think the short version, in fact, to a very long story there is if you have any intention of doing some form of preliminary market engagement, do a notice. Absolutely. Permitted purposes in terms of what might be considered preliminary market engagement include developing the authority's requirements and approach to the procurement. So going back to my earlier point around helping shape and define that scope of requirements or specification, designing a procedure or conditions of participation or award right criteria, and preparing the tender notice and associated tender documents. There's a balance here, of course, as well, isn't there, Fleur? And we all know how you love a good bit of best practice there. The same with the Procurement Act itself and the outgoing public contract regulations. We have to be incredibly careful within the public sector around what we detail in our scope and our evaluation criteria, not so it's skewed in a way that it suits a particular supplier or their offering itself. So continually being mindful of all this extra intel that you can obviously obtain by doing these market sounding and preliminary market engagement exercises, but not writing it in such a way that ultimately the exercise is uncompetitive because you've written it in a way that ultimately only one or just a few handful of providers could compete. It goes against everything that transparency stands for, would you say, Fleur?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess just to wrap up this stage, given some of the changes both mandated and where we now have the have regard statement is placed within the regulations in relation to SME, social value and sustainability. This could also be the point in time where you start to consider these areas within your procurement documentation and how they're going to work, how you're going to test it, those type of things. For example, how could SMEs get involved? E.g., would lots work for your requirement, lotting strategies, those type of areas? Do we want to measure social value and how are we going to do it and how can we incorporate it and then report on it at a later date? What are our requirements in terms of sustainability? All types of areas that you could start to plan and detail in your strategy.
Yeah, definitely. And as you've said already just now there, Fleur, the whole have regard element and, despite what the Act and the regulations say, there is a clear indication that, in particular, support around SMEs and making opportunities from a public procurement perspective to be as readily available and then feel comfortable that they can compete for public sector opportunities. So a lot of thought needs to be done around that and how the procurement exercises are shaped and ultimately advertised as well, so that it can generate interest from SMEs and it actually gives them the confidence that their submissions will be considered and seriously considered. So a lot of planning, thought and consideration in that step around that point, in addition to what you've said in relation to social value and sustainability too, for sure. Okay, so on the next step then, which is develop documentation and the detailed specification itself, of course, and notwithstanding what we've just said in relation to the previous step, and in an event of perhaps maybe utilising a selection questionnaire approach. I almost said PQQ then, Fleur, but a selection questionnaire approach. You'd have told me off for that, wouldn't you? You know that this is as per the existing public contract regulations. You would need to, at the very least, have your invitation to tender documentation available in draft form for inspection by the market. But regardless, let's assume that you've not gone down an SQ pathway or an SQ route. And therefore, within this step, it would be a continuation of the activity and further progress to the development of all of the required procurement documentation.
So I think key here in this stage is defining of how you're going to run your procurement, especially if you're looking to utilise the new competitive flexible procedure. So this is really where you're going to have to detail and define and document how your process is going to work, the number of stages involved. Is there going to be a reduction of suppliers in the instance of a multi-stage approach, negotiation, dialogue, presentation? This is where you're going to need to start really defining this and working it through.
Yeah, for sure. And it's important to remember that you need to follow what it is that you've detailed within these documents. Yeah. So it's vital to get these correct in readiness for publication. In a scenario where you're looking at doing an open framework, then again, these documents are going to be key in terms of defining how this innovative approach is going to work and the frequency in which the framework is going to be reopened. Again, something, Fleur, that we've covered at length in previous episodes.
Yeah, so we've also touched on like internal development of KPIs, which will be, I think we've talked about this quite a lot, reported on a later date throughout the contract life. But sticking with the theme of making sure things are correct and comfortable at the time of publication.
Yeah, no, definitely. So again, like with all the steps that we've covered previously, a hell of a lot to consider, that's for sure. So then we're going to move on to supplier selection to participate in the tender itself. So this is content heavy in terms of the step itself. Yeah. Again, this is our interpretation, so please bear with us. This step in the process would mark the beginning of the procurement process and will include the publication of the tender notice, which replaces the previous contract notice. The Procurement Act itself specifies certain minimum time limits which contracting authorities must comply with during a competitive tendering procedure. The minimum time limits are set out within the Act to ensure compliance with the UK's international obligations on public procurement, of course.
So some of the things that we've noted as part of this is that there's new terminologies that we're all going to have to get used to in terms of we're now going to have, and specifically in terms of your timescales, participation periods and your tendering periods. So again, that links to like your different stages. The timescales, I think, remain largely the same as what we currently have in terms of the minimum time periods that you must be provide for responses. And of course, they don't set any maximum time periods. So lots of details within the Act, and comparing it with a stage of this cycle means that it's predominantly aligns to the selection stage and the use of, as we were talking about before, a selection questionnaire, which is based on the new procedures, and I guess it would then be applicable to anyone that is using a competitive flexible procedure, as that is when you would have your selection stage. So one of the themes linked to the Procurement Act is the conditions of participation in which a supplier must pass in order to be awarded a public contract. And similar to how it is now, it links mainly to like your legal and your financial capacity or technical ability to perform the contract.
Yeah, and in short, then, there must be a proportionate means of ensuring that the supplier's relevant capacity or availability, and here we go again, Fleur, having regard to the nature, complexity and cost of public contracts. That's the Act's wording, not ours, I'm hastened to add. It's important here again and suggested to date that the central digital platform will store supplier information that may be relevant to assessing conditions of participation. So are we right in what we're saying there, Fleur, in terms of that might give some form of a head start for the public procuring body when they have access to that data?
Yeah, so I think this was what was referred to previously as like the tell us once functionality.
Yeah.
So whereas all different authorities having their own systems and asking the same information and bidders having to put the same like high levels, like just organisational details, my understanding is that you're going to use or suppliers will use the central digital platform and register on there and put those informations on there. And then as part of any procurement process, you pull the information through. So it's that you only tell them once in terms of that key information. So in terms of like the regulations, and anyone that's been on the commercial college training and deep dive sessions know, I think it's Regulation 6 requires contracting authorities to obtain confirmation from suppliers that they have submitted up-to-date core supplier information. That's probably what I was trying to get to on the central digital platform, and that such core information it has been shared. So from a supplier's perspective, those that compete for sector or opportunities and contracts will need to share certain information via the central digital platform in order to participate, and any other information that is required would be collected in the same way it is now via contracting authorities' own electronic tendering systems.
Absolutely. And we would also, when considering the cycle, interpret that at this stage we would include the submission of the selection questionnaire responses, for example, and the evaluation based on what was defined initially. Not necessarily aligned to the cycle here, but well worth a mention. I'd suggest at this juncture it would be the exclusions, and the Act updates the previous legislation insofar as that the PCRs and bringing it together a single exclusion regime, replacing those set out in the current legislation. It introduced new mandatory exclusion groups in which contracting authorities must exclude suppliers for any convictions of certain offences. We have the new discretionary exclusion grounds in areas such as poor performance, national security threats, enabling contracting authorities to take tougher action on underperforming suppliers. That's a real positive step there. Perhaps a contentious element is, of course, making the exclusion grounds UK specific, but also ensuring that they apply to certain events which occur overseas as well. So it's striking that balance again, isn't it, Fleur, in terms of this particular point here?
Yeah, and a hopeful positive step in the Act is around creating a clearer set of rules outlining when a supplier must or may be excluded due to an exclusion ground applying to a connected person or associated persons. We know that flexibility was a key driver for the change in the Act, and therefore giving authorities greater flexibility to consider a range of evidence of self-cleaning by suppliers in order to assess whether the circumstances giving rise to an exclusion ground are likely to occur again. On the subject of exclusion, extending the time limit for consideration of relevant means for discretionary exclusion grounds to 5 years now matches the mandatory exclusion grounds.
Yeah, it definitely does. And it's probably worth defining what is meant by way of a definition of an excluded and excludable supplier at this particular point too as well. It's starting off with an excluded supplier then. So this is an instance whereby a contracting authority considers that the mandatory exclusion ground applies to the supplier in question. That supplier in question then will also be an excluded supplier where this has already been determined and are on the new debarment list because of the mandatory exclusion ground. Or grounds, in fact. I suppose it could be multiple instances. Yeah, for sure. So that's excluded supplier. And then we look at the terminology and definition by way of an excludable supplier. So this is where a contracting authority considers that a discretionary exclusion ground applies to the supplier and that the circumstance is continuing or likely to again occur in the future. It can also be an excludable supplier where it has already been determined on the department list because of the discretionary exclusion ground or grounds again. So that's the definition and differentiation between both excluded and excludable supplier.
Yeah, and I guess you briefly mentioned it there in terms of those definitions, but within this step, we obviously now also have the new debarment list, which is a new mechanism under the Procurement Act, which is where a Minister of the Crown can put a supplier on a centrally published debarment list if they are satisfied I've got if a supplier is an excluded supplier or an excludable supplier. So that sort of picks up those areas that you were talking around in terms of the definitions. So our understanding is that the debarment list is managed by the Procurement Review Unit, which again is new, and it must always be checked by the contracting authorities when undertaking a procurement. So yeah, another feature that procurement colleagues like ourselves need to get to grips with in terms of those procurement stages.
For sure, and a new feature, and a feature that gives the sector a little bit of power. Just trying to wrap my brains in terms of what the movie is now. Is it Spider-Man? With great power comes great responsibility. That's exactly what we've got there, haven't we? In terms of making those determinations in relation to the reasons and justifications of how and why a supplier will find themselves on that debarment list, whether that be excluded or excludable. So yeah, a lot to think about yet again.
Exactly. So I think that probably brings us to the end of our little, I was calling this like a mini podcast series of like trying to align the Procurement Act to a generic procurement life cycle. So yeah, it has been a lot of detail, but we've also really enjoyed talking about this, haven't we? And coming up with areas that we think are included. We've had a few discussions about things where I've had one view, you've had another view. So yeah, it's been quite fun. But we'll look to pick up as part of the next episode the remaining section. So I think it will take us from where we'd got to in terms of publishing your tender through to like contract management side of things. So yeah, that will be a good discussion that we can pick up on. But I hope that you have really enjoyed this slightly different take on a podcast episode. It's been a great way of looking at the Procurement Act, and has definitely made us have like some good discussions.
Yeah, and for me, just to say, make sure that you join us for the next episode where we'll be covering the remainder of that procurement cycle, of course. And who knows, by that point, we may even have an update in terms of the go live date and whether the current rumours become more than just rumours themselves. So we will see.
See you in the next episode.
Bye for now.